Welcome back, everyone. You are in the right place. Do not adjust your volume. You are on the Duty Bound podcast, and this is our midday podcast. So mid-month payday podcast. It is the 15th of the month. I'm always excited about our special guest, and I've got someone who's done the work. It's Social Work Awareness Month, so of course we got a social worker on here. So I'm very excited. My co-host and I. Ayana is in the building. Kim is sort of in the building. She's in the car in the building, but Ayana, Mike, welcome to the show. Everybody, we're recording on a Thursday, so it's like right before the weekend. Are y'all ready for the weekend?
Ready.
Yes.
I'm like wishing it was Friday already. Ayana.
Yeah.
You're ready for Friday? Is it Friday for you already?
Mm-mm.
No. Does the weekend bring any relief? Like, do people still be like, I'm ready for the weekend?
My phone rings less on the weekend. I know that. So that's nice.
Pretty much. I think it's going to be spring break. So at least I have a week. I don't have to be on the computer every day.
Okay. Mike, do you typically?
I am ready for the weekend on Tuesday. So it's always my time to just relax and not do things.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I want you to introduce yourself to our audience, your military affiliation and your current job position. So please tell everyone who you are.
Thanks. My name is Mike Crum. I am a Marine Corps veteran. So I spent some time in the Marines. Both my stepdads were Marines. My brother was a Marine. My mom's brother was a career Marine. So kind of a family tradition there. My mom has 5 brothers and 4 of them all served. I currently reside in Madison, Wisconsin.
So no way you were going into the Navy.
No. Or Army or Air Force, right? Or Coast Guard. So currently work for the Wisconsin Army National Guard as a contractor. So I teach resiliency to soldiers, leaders, and I do suicide intervention training and things like that too for the National Guard.
Awesome. Amazing. So happy Social Work Month to you.
Thank you. I got my bachelor's degree in social work, my master's degree, and currently working on my doctorate degree. So I figured why not just go all out.
Yes, I saw that. I'm very excited to dive into that. So, speaking of you being a legacy Marine, because I feel like there's a legacy that comes along with this. When did you leave or retire or?
Yeah, I went in 1997. It's a long time ago. And got out in 2001. So prior to 9/11, I had 60 days of leave saved up and got out at the right time, I suppose. So
wow. And what did you immediately do when you transitioned from the Marine Corps back to, and I want to say back to, how old were you when you enlisted?
I was 18 right out of high school. So yeah.
Okay. So what was that transition like for you?
I think sometimes, especially a branch like the Marine Corps, where they harp on, being the best branch and the best uniform and you're the best of the best. And you kind of get this attitude that you can do anything, which you can. But being a truck driver in the Marine Corps, I didn't want to be a truck driver in the civilian world. And it took me a really, really, really long time to figure out what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So being a Marine on one hand was great, but it didn't really get me very far for long.
As a truck driver, right? So there was a come to Jesus moment, kind of where you're like, what am I going to do? I imagine at 21, you didn't really think, what am I going to do the rest of my life?
Yeah. So 21, 22, I think I got out at 22. And then of course, love happened, and then I had a child, and then you're like, okay, now I really need to figure things out. But I did a lot of things backwards. So
as life would have it. Do you find the transitioning services like kind of just expanding on the question, the transitioning services now versus when you were transitioning, was there a lot of help for how do I
There's help.
transfer these
Yeah.
skills?
I mean, they did what they call it, a transition class, TAPS class or something. But I don't think at that time it was very helpful. It's really hard, I think, working with soldiers now to take somebody's experience and translate it into civilian speak, putting together a resume and putting together keywords and trying to match those certain jobs. I think there's a lot of stigma about hiring veterans, although a lot of companies say we hire veterans and we're veterans friendly. I work with a lot of soldiers in the military that, like, I've applied to 20 jobs and I can't get an interview. And some of that is some of that is, resumes and that kind of stuff. But I still think there's stigma out there about what veterans might bring on the job in terms of mental health and that kind of stuff that is an additional barrier.
I know with my co-hosts on here, like we can all raise our hands. Is any one of us doing the jobs that we did in the military? Not any one of us. None of us are doing
Right.
It's very rare unless you go in like with a career, like a lawyer or a doctor, to find service members that are doing the things that they originally did. Although Ayana has a fabulous, story about what she did, and I'm not going to take her thunder. So, but her job involving working on in the Navy was one of a kind. But passions and doing a job are very, very different, very, very
Absolutely.
different things. Yeah. So what led you to your doctorate and what are you currently working on? What is your dissertation?
Yeah, I'm so working in resiliency with the National Guard is pretty interesting. I have a passion for a lot of things, but I also respect law enforcement and first responders. So I'm working on how social workers can provide more resilience and wellness training to first responders. So, we talk a lot about veteran suicide, but data shows that law enforcement has higher rates of suicide because they are exposed to trauma more on a daily basis. And the stigma that happens within law enforcement and the first responder community is higher because of perception and different, especially over the last few years, we've seen a lot of different things. And so you have higher rates of suicide, higher rates of exposure to trauma. Law enforcement particularly doesn't want to use the same resources in the communities that they live. So then where do they go for mental health treatment? Right. So that's kind of what I'm working on my doctorate on, how to get social work to be more aware of opportunities to bridge the gap between social work and law enforcement, where there's kind of been a shaky relationship between the two professions.
Awesome. Well, kudos to you. How deep are you into this doctoral work?
I am 98% complete. I have my research.
Yes.
Yeah, I have my research. I'm writing my research. I've submitted it to the professor and she's kicked it back saying, fix all these things. So
Okay.
now it's just kind of at that, trying to get it approved in an academic way. And hopefully in the next 3 months or so, I'll be done. So
Awesome. So what led you to social work after truck driving, being in the Marine Corps, going through life, figuring it out, and now here? What led you to social work? We asked this question to each other during the first half of the month about being social workers and working in the counseling community. What led you to social work?
Kind of cliche. I say that social work found me. After the Marine Corps, I did try college. I wanted to do criminal justice and become a cop, but college just didn't work out for me the first time around. And then I don't even remember how I found a social work program, but I needed a program to be closer to my son. And we're just kind of looking at different universities, and social work was like, okay, this sounds really interesting. I've always been good at helping with people, always been good at, I think it was psychology. I wanted to do psychology, and from that I found social work. So started with a BSW program and just kept with it.
Awesome. Ayana.
Hey, Mike.
I,
Thank you for all that. One thing that you mentioned, I'm not trying to add to your work, but definitely thank you for acknowledging the first responders, and because especially in my community, there is a huge issue with police, and I feel like you're right that there's not enough recognition for what they go through. As far as, I always said that it's funny how you don't get acknowledged for your PTS until you're in the military, but some people grow up with that. You know what I mean?
yeah.
I didn't get no medal for living in, the neighborhood I lived in, but I saw stuff, lots of stuff, and there's other people that are living with that every single day, who have a gun in their hand, and we're requiring them to be protective and be calm, but yet are we putting them in situations that they can't be, because they're not getting the help to squeeze out everything that they just soaked up. Is it affecting their judgment? Absolutely. How can it not? So it's just like lowering those expectations. I did want to bring up, if you don't already know about it, have you ever heard of the Boulder Crest retreat?
I have not.
Definitely check that one out. I think they initiated the Warrior Path, PATHH program. It's one of the few programs that I cannot actually apply to, because I'm not a combat veteran, but it's for combat veterans and first responders. And it's just read the testimonials. I'm actually going to be meeting up with a spouse that I referred her husband there, and the testimonials specifically from the spouses are amazing, but definitely check that out.
I will, definitely.
Yeah, definitely check it out. Yeah. So my question now is, what was it about your time in that led you back to serving those who serve?
I think a lot of veterans, some veterans are a little more outwardly spoken. I'm kind of more, people ask me about my experience. I'll tell them, yeah, I served some time in the Marines or whatever. And I don't usually wear identifying clothing, or, some veterans have the hat, they have the sweatshirt, they have the whole nine, and I think in college, a lot of universities talk about diversity. They talk about culture. They talk about representation and those kind of things. And as a student veteran, I wasn't getting that same experience. And as a student veteran, there was still a lot of stigma, or even talking about benefits, or you had different groups that had student lounges for different groups of students, and different clubs and different things. So I think it was really there I started to say, okay, well, let me start to advocate for some student veteran services. Created the first Student Veterans of America chapter at the university I was going, and then got more involved in policy. So I wrote a letter to the president of the university and said, here's what we're missing. And he responded, and I was like, okay, I can actually make things happen. But my approach has always been, it's not about the problem. Anybody can bring a problem to anybody. It's, here's the problem, here's how we can address it and actually collaborate and work together, without being unreasonable in a sense. So that kind of started me on this journey that I'm on now of, what are other veterans issues? What are other things at universities or even in the community that I really started to learn how to, one, be an advocate, and then two, how to ruffle feathers in a tactful way. And I'm really good at that.
I love that. To ruffle the feathers in a tactful way.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I need that class, I guess. So, but from the time you were in until now, how confident? Huh?
No, I didn't say anything. Go ahead.
Okay, so Mike, from the time you were in until now, how confident are you in the changes around mental health culture
I'm
and
pretty confident.
sexual assault and harassment as well? So mental health culture, sexual assault culture, harassment culture. How
Yeah,
confident are you in those changes, if any?
I'm fairly confident that there's been a lot of changes. In 1997, 90, I mean, when I was in, I can't even count on one time that we had a class on sexual assault, harassment. I was in the Marine Corps. Like we were young and we would go party in Mexico or Japan and drink and party. And, we never talked about this kind of stuff when I was in. Did sexual assaults happen? Yes. Did suicide happen? Yes. Did other things happen? Absolutely. But it was never from our leadership talked about in the 90s that I can remember. We were never
I
sat
think
down and go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think an important part of that, as well as you said, you got out in 2001. SAPR, the SAPR program wasn't even established until 2005. So I think that really speaks to the culture you're talking about and the environment. It wasn't even, it wasn't even a priority,
Yeah, it wasn't a priority and it wasn't on our radar or leadership's radar. We were told not to do things. Hey, don't do this. But we weren't given any education or prevention or intervention or the things that you see now, especially with the National Guard and working with the Army. There's a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of, briefs, but I don't know if soldiers are, I don't know, especially with the National Guard, because everything is so mission orientated. We have a certain mission. We need to prepare for deployment. We need to do all these things. We need to do equipment checks. We need to do weapons checks. We need to, say, and then stopping and saying, oh, we need to do a brief on sexual harassment for 30 minutes. I get it. I get the whole, well, it's a check the box kind of thing. And then nobody actually leaves that room saying, hey, if I see this happening, maybe I need to be the one to report it.
Yeah.
I think the other side of that is there's an interesting transition where you have different generations serving in the military now. Generationally, how people view sexual assault, suicide, those kind of things. There seems to be no accountability for senior leaders who ignore some of those things.
Yeah.
So on one hand, yes, I would like to believe there's been more change, but more change needs to happen.
Yeah. I think they're still doing those briefs where they're like, don't touch people. And that's pretty much it. They're just going in like, don't do these bad things, but there's no prevention. Everything seems to be very reactive to what's happening versus the prevention side of how do we, stop people rather than just going in and saying, hey, don't touch people.
Yeah. And there's a lot of stigma, I know, there's people who do report things, so you talk about whistleblowers and those kind of things that are afraid to speak up because of other things that they've experienced. So it's complex, but I also think, when you look at how the military is made up, DoD doesn't necessarily put out things for all branches, because what the Army does is different than what the Marine Corps does, is different what the Navy does is different than, so none of these branches are communicating and saying, well, how do we tackle this together?
You're speaking my language, Mike. You're speaking my language. Even learning the nuances of like the Navy calls it sapper, correct? You guys call it sapper, where the Army calls it sharp. And
right.
Yeah, it's very, very different. Just the fact that they could change the name, even though it's underneath of this one umbrella,
Right. And even looking at, even the Marine Corps doesn't have its own programs like that because they use the Navy because they're under the Department of the Navy. So you have that kind of weird nuance too. And then the Coast Guard is on their own because they're not a part of DoD. They're a part of, another government agency. So there's just no consistency there.
And nobody's even talking about the Space Force. Kim.
Right.
Nobody, that's not even part of, I just looked at the second quarter suicide statistics. There's nothing on there about Space Force. Zero.
Does that mean that they're happy? Or I mean, what? Or that? I mean, it's so new.
And they're just forgotten about.
Or
I
under
believe
Air
so.
Force.
I think they lumped them in, but even so, I mean, the Navy is part of the Marine Corps is part of the Department of the Navy. So yet they still can count the Navy as its own entity. I don't know if they just don't have enough numbers or it's because of Space Force falls underneath of the Air Force. But I just find it interesting that even though this branch has been around, they have their own song, they have their own everything, uniforms, but they are not part of any of the statistical data that came out in fourth quarter. Interesting. Kim, you had your hand up.
I know. I feel like I got to raise my hand because y'all can't see me like thinking and processing, about to say something. But, we're talking about the different service branches and them not working together. And, I did training on the integrated prevention policy and how we're supposed to be taking a primary prevention approach to being effective and being impactful. But even in that training and some other times, it would be very, well, that's not going to work for us because we're the Navy and you can't do that on a ship or, vice versa. And I think that sometimes, I don't know, I wanted to get your opinion, Mike, but I think sometimes that mindset of like, we're so different is actually like a huge barrier to just saying, okay, but sexual assault, suicide, all of these things, there's not a different, like, it doesn't discriminate between branches, and so the approaches can still be the same. Obviously, different things might need to be adapted, but not necessarily completely different. So do you feel like those different, those attitudes, I guess, or mindsets that were all very different, do you think that's a barrier or do you think that that's necessary?
I think it's a barrier because even if you look at sexual assault, right, the Army, every branch will come out with next month is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. The Army has a tagline, at the installation that I work at, they have signs, it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, there's purple everywhere, all this other stuff. And then when it comes to Suicide Awareness Month, there's nothing. We don't talk about suicide. We can't post anything about it. Here's an email about what to do for your soldiers, but we can't have Suicide Awareness Month on our installation. You can't post things. Why is sexual assault could lead to suicide, but when it comes to actually awareness, you're not doing that in a public way. You're still kind of saying, okay, we can have trainings about it, but we don't want to talk publicly open about it, right?
Wow.
So yeah, I think it is a barrier in that we look at each other differently, our branches, although there's, we talk about like this competitive nature and we're all on the same team. But we do look at different branches differently and we don't play on the same team when it comes to some of these difficult conversations.
That shocks me in 2023.
Absolutely.
I'm shocked that there's no awareness for suicide in where you are.
I travel a lot for my job, right? I've traveled on the West Coast. I've traveled on the East Coast. I'm currently in New Hampshire. And I walk into different installations. I walk into different National Guard units. And I purposefully look for information. Mm-hmm. And, in a break room or a lunchroom, here's the suicide number. But there is no other information. There is no, like, I will see, here's your sharp person, your sexual assault person posted in a male's bathroom with a picture of a female on it. And then me as a male, you want me to reach out to that person if I've been assaulted. I can't connect to that. But then there's no information. Well, if I'm having thoughts of suicide, who's the suicide prevention coordinator? It's not posted anywhere. So there's just inconsistencies in that sense of how do we tie these things together so that we can actually do proper intervention and prevention kind of care.
That's good. You got more, Ayana?
Yeah, I actually brought up to the next question, because as a male social worker, Mike, do you feel that you're more inept to open, that men are more inept to open up to you, or do you find you have to build rapport with them longer?
I have to build rapport with them longer. I can mention, like, if I'm working with the National Guard and I mention I'm a social worker, then they look at me like I'm there to fix them, or they think I'm a clinician. I'm not a clinician, right? I don't have my LCSW. I'm a advocacy policy kind of social worker. And the same with law enforcement. If I work with law enforcement and I walk in and do a training and like, yeah, my background is social work. I'm here to talk to you about resilience. This guy, right? Like, I can see the eye rolls. I can see but if I walk in and say I'm a Marine and I happen to be a social worker, oh, okay, this guy kind of has some, right? So it takes me more to build rapport with men, which is interesting. And then I think the other piece, when we have these difficult conversations that we're talking about, suicide, mental health, sexual assaults, there's still stigma behind that. There's still stigma with men of talking about those things. And then having that rapport for somebody to not just disclose. And I think in my experience, what matters the most is my next response. If a man comes up to me and says, I'm having thoughts of suicide, my response shouldn't be, what the hell are you thinking? Why would you do that? That's dumb.
Yeah.
My response should be, wow, that's pretty scary. Let's talk about that. So or even if a man come up to me and said, I was sexually assaulted, and in my response is something like, well, that sucks. I just ruined that whole interaction.
Yeah.
Right? I just ruined that whole rapport and trust. So I think people, men and women, disclose a lot of times. I think when they disclose to a leader, that response shuts them down more times than none, and they never bring it up again.
Yeah.
And then when they do attempt suicide or they do die by suicide, then we missed the signs. We didn't know. You knew, you just didn't respond in an appropriate way that could have prevented that from happening.
Or knew the signs and
Right.
the right things to say.
Yep.
I mean, we brought up two things to me that stood out, and that's one about the social work. We briefly talked about the different facets of social work at the beginning of the podcast with Social Work Awareness Month. But I just want to highlight that you said that I'm not a clinician and that you focus on policy. And I think that's one of those like nuances of social work that people don't understand, that there are social workers out here that are macro and they work on the bigger issues like policy, and they're the ones that are going and lobbyists. There are social workers that are lobbyists that are literally working in the government to have policies to change the things that we do. So yeah, I did not like macro social work.
Yeah, I'm not I love like mental health and learning about, trauma and those things. I'll read all that and I'll be informed, but I want to get into the legislator's office and say, hey, here's a problem, here's how we can fix it. Or even within the Army, right? Even at the National Guard level, talking to Army leaders in different states or whatever, or even just within my community. I serve on different boards and do policy that way. And so that's what I know, the strengths that I have. I also get bored really easily, so I couldn't sit and listen to somebody tell me their problems all day, because I would feel I would do them a disservice, because I get bored. Yeah. And I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, let's get outside and let's do something. I need to be active.
And I think
Ayana's like, yes.
you're like sitting there listening to them. And to me, I'm the same way. I'm a macro social worker. And to me, like I'm listening to this person talk to me and I'm, being in the moment trying to help them. But at the same time, I'm like, this policy needs to change. I need to talk to this person. Like these people need to be fired.
Yes.
Like I'm thinking everything on a macro scale, not on, I really focus when I'm listening to them, but at the same time, I'm like already thinking about the policies, the programs, the people, So
Yep.
I'm right there with you. Heck yeah, to macro social workers.
Yeah, she said, toast to you, macro social workers. But Ayana, the rare breed, lovely she is like, I want to get outside, but she likes talking to the individual too. So,
Yeah, well, I'm gonna just say when I get mine, we going outside. Look at here, we're gonna do this walking therapy. We're gonna do this
there you go.
yoga therapy. Because I'm not, or also because I'm going to be a clinician. My thing is, I'm like, you have the answers. You have the answer. You don't need to come to me for the answer. That's just all my thing. I'll tell you what when we throw this in there before we go to Kim, Mike, I got one for you. You're working on policies. We talked a lot about prevention. I honestly believe that whether you are a person going to schools, going into the military, you got boot camp, or, you're going to join the police force, to me, that's where the learning should start, the reprogramming, because like, look at here, I know you came out here and you here for this job. What this job is going to entail is you rethinking how you deal with sexuality and how you talk to people from right now. We're going to practice whatever it takes for you to unlearn everything you saw out in them streets, because it's a whole different ball game. So we keep talking about, again, fixing it after the fact, but I feel like people come in with these habits and things that they've learned that are not beneficial to the job that they're about to do. And to talk to them after the fact, like, you mentioned, you said about, we're doing the equipment checks, we're doing, this and that. We are the equipment, and when the military starts realizing and valuing us as this walking person that's worth millions of dollars, maybe they'll think about that. Because Lord knows when it comes time to the claims, that's when this, they'll put you through all types of hell. All my, clients going through absolute hell, to the point that sometimes I have to question, are you guys trying to drive them to suicide? I don't know. It's smelling like that. But the fact is, when they start valuing the people, when preferably before another war, don't just say, oh, we need you now that we're running out of people, because these kids these days, they're watching what's not happening. These kids these days are living with parents who have been traumatized by their jobs, and they see how messed up that has done with the family. They're turned off in the military. And until the military starts deciding to show that, no, we actually are going to start acting right, those numbers are going to continue to dwindle with people not wanting to join.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see the Army just came out with a whole new rebranding message because of retention, right? They had to rebrand everything because of retention. And it's treating people like people, not as soldiers, or that you're expendable.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, right. And that's with any branch. So, yeah.
Just so happens that the Army is the largest employer, and a lot of people focus on that. And not realizing that the smaller branches, the smaller your numbers are in comparison to how many people are dying by suicide, how many people are being assaulted, it doesn't make it any better. It just so happens that the Army just happens to be the largest employer. But if people are still being assaulted at a rate of 1 to 4 in any branch, it's worse. 1 to 4 when you have 500,000 soldiers, it's not the same as 1 to 4 when you have 100,000. So it's I think that part gets lost on leaders, and it gets lost on the civilian population when you think about it. And they're like, oh, you're the 1% of people that serve, and you're like, yes, but in society, the average for a woman to be assaulted in society, and it's the same. 1 in 4, 1 in 6. And yet we're 1%. That's not a good thing to say. So
it's not. And to Kimberly's point, there's been a shift in now we want to focus on prevention, or violence prevention within the military. So they've put a ton of money into violence prevention. And we'll see if that works or not. But
Well, I think they put money into developing training and, the initial pieces of it. But if you don't have an organization that has that capacity, they're still going to just be check in the box trainings. You know what I mean? And they're still just going to be like, you can have the best plan ever, the best product, but unless you can implement it, it does no good, And so,
Yeah.
I think the training's awesome. I mean, not just because I gave the training, but I think the training, it's evidence-based. It's based off real stuff that works. But when I go and give that training to the commander and say, this is what works, we need to do a needs assessment, they're going to be like, what? No, I'm not doing that. Or you do it. And you can't do a needs assessment without their participation. And so I think part of the big piece of that is the implementation. Well, we'll see if it works,
Yeah. And what to Ayana's credit and to your credit, Mike, about the generations that are serving, this younger generation that's not tolerant for garbage and the older generation that came up with it. I think the shift in mindset is to also realize that we're not fighting the same wars. So when we think about violence prevention, we're talking about military members that grew up and like you prior to 9/11, where the threat of war was hand-to-hand combat. Most soldiers nowadays are pushing a button. Yes, there's some that are still knocking down doors and kicking in, and kicking in walls. But for the most part, this war is fought behind a computer, and there's drones and unmanned vehicles, and, there's missiles that are very, very on point and targeted. So there's like this shift also that has to be understood, that how we fight is not the same. And, we're supposed to train as we fight. Right. So you've got soldiers that are deploying who otherwise would never see a combat situation. They're not training like that. And you're sending people that are, I swear I'm not trying to be funny, but all I can think of is the comedian. I'm trying to think of his name, not Pauly Shore. The one who did the movie In the Army now. I can't think of his name.
That is Pauly Shore.
It is Pauly Shore. Oh, yeah. God. I was hoping not to be right. But all I keep thinking about, he's like this water purification specialist. Right? I'm going to be a water purification specialist. And this joker winds up deploying. He's like, I'm not supposed to be. You have so many people that are literally like, yeah, I signed up to do HR. And they're like, yeah, you're deploying and you've got to learn how to shoot a weapon. I'm like, when would I ever?
Yeah. I mean, in my time, it was, here's your M16, know your M16, you're going to get deployed and potentially use this in combat. And the way that, the Marine Corps has shifted, they've taken away tanks and all of that heavy equipment, and they're moving to a more technological kind of rapid response force. I wouldn't know how to do any of that stuff, right? So it's a different cult. But even when we talk about mental health, and some of these topics, the younger generation, I think, doesn't have an issue talking about it because of their values and beliefs, but the older generation has an issue talking about it still. So you have that divide of values and beliefs. And with senior leaders who are in those roles, they're going to control how that stuff is addressed or not addressed.
We don't, us, the older millennials and Gen Xers. Yeah, like I tell people that I walked to school when I was like 7 years old.
And I think there's a change in tolerance. I'm not, just because you went through this cool tradition that was a hazing process and whatever, doesn't make me any less of a sailor or a service member because I'm not getting hazed. I'm just not going to tolerate it, And so I think the values are definitely different, but I just feel like the tolerance is as well. I mean, when I got out, it was just because I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. This is ridiculous, a bunch of other reasons, but I think tolerance is a huge difference.
Did you want to come? Oh, my, Ayana, do you want to finish out 7 and 8?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. So March is also Self-Harm Awareness Month, if you didn't know. And since you always speak on suicide prevention and intervention methods, do you see self-harm in certain demographics more than others? And also, do you talk about those intersectionalities?
It's a really interesting question because suicide data tends to be a little outdated sometimes. But I think when we talk about culture, like my background is Hispanic, I'm Mexican. And traditionally, you've seen lower rates of suicide within African American communities and Hispanic communities. Over the last couple of years, that's shifted, where you've seen more suicides in young African American women and teenagers, and Hispanic populations as well. So yeah, I think it's important to talk about those intersectionalities and to educate different communities about suicide and having awareness about mental health, or having awareness about, yeah, we might come from a background of like what happens in this house stays in this house. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it's also okay to ask for help. It's also okay to ask for resources. But who do you trust in your communities if you live in a predominantly Hispanic or Black community or Asian community? I'm probably not going to go to a white therapist because they don't understand some of the things that those individuals go through in those communities. I know, Yana, you talk about living in a community and trauma happens, right? Whether there's gun violence or other violence or gang violence, or, we talk about adverse childhood trauma. So many military members join the military to get away from communities where they've experienced trauma, and not just one trauma, but multiple traumas.
Yeah.
So then you ask them to put on a uniform and get prepared for combat and then go to war, and then they go to war. Well, now they have more trauma on top of additional trauma that was never addressed. But go ahead and go to this therapist, they'll understand. No, they don't understand.
Yeah. We talk about that a lot.
Yeah. So
or how about I just joined to get away from this, and I just got traumatized by my peer,
your battle.
my mate, my battle buddy, my shipmate, and okay, let's go ahead and go and hang out and just be okay with that.
Yeah.
And they'll say, and matter of fact, I get to watch this person go ahead and get an award. Yeah, that's
right. Or get promoted.
Switch at all,
Right. Yeah, or get promoted above everybody else.
Yeah.
And there's that idea of moral trauma as well that I think there's some newer research and stuff around. And then that person ends up either getting kicked out or getting a bad conduct discharge, or something, or they don't have the proper resources to address mental health, and then they're right back in the community where they experienced that trauma to begin with.
Yeah.
So yeah, on suicide prevention, there's a shift in some of those intersectionalities about culture that we're not having that conversation about. So it's really important, I think, within the general community, but also the military community, to think about those demographics. But then also, what does suicide prevention intervention look like for a community? I did a presentation once for Native American group in Wisconsin. They asked me to speak, and I was talking to an elder, and she said, we don't even have a word for suicide in our culture. So it's hard for people to understand what this is.
Yeah.
I never thought about that before.
Wow.
So, you think about like Asian cultures where even looking somebody in the eye can be disrespectful, or, so culturally, I think it's important to understand how they view mental health in kind of a broad way, but then where does something like suicide fit into that? And even if you go back in history, you just look at like Japanese culture and kamikaze pilots, it was an honor to do that for your country, to die for your country and kill yourself.
Yeah.
Is it in Japan where they have a place where it's acceptable?
Yeah.
So how do you balance some of those things? And one of the trainings that I do, we ask people up front, when it comes to suicide, do people have a right to suicide?
In the UK they do. I don't want to say the UK. Lord knows I want to get this country right. I recently just read that a woman that there, and I want to say I'm not going to say European country. I just know that it's there. Sweden,
Yeah.
maybe, or something like that, where they literally call it euthanized. I thought it was a very weird way to say that it's assisted suicide, but it's mainly for people that have terminal diseases. But this woman was, I believe, in prison, and decided that she wanted to be euthanized, rather than to spend the rest of her life in prison. And I was just, I thought, like, isn't that the death penalty? But she chose it, and in that country particularly, they do have euthanization, of people that do have terminal illnesses or otherwise, health disparities that they feel like they're not going to have a good quality of life if they continue.
Yeah. And even in the US, when we look at suicide, is suicide right or wrong? We tend to say, well, it's wrong. Okay. And it's not necessarily wrong. It goes against some of our values and beliefs. So, it's kind of a complex conversation, but, looking at this question, I do see self-harm in certain demographics more than others. But I also think it's important to know where those shifts are happening, especially in different cultural populations.
Go ahead, Kim.
And as y'all were talking, I was just thinking about all these cultures have different views, or don't even talk about things like suicide or violent sexual assault. And I still feel like we're very behind when it comes to being a culturally aware organization in the military. And so it doesn't, again, with implementation, it doesn't matter how great the training is or the new policies are. Like, if you're not able to connect with your community and the diversity and the cultures, and understand that, then you're not really going to be able to implement it. And I think that there's a huge disconnect between, we can't just have an hour training or an all-day training and talk about like suicide is bad. Like, some people, it's not going to connect with them. So you're really not being effective. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Diversity without inclusion, Ayana said.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, Anna, on to the next.
Me or Kim?
Kim, are you able to see the questions now?
Oh yeah, I can ask. Number 8. What does your self-care routine look like, or how often do you really dedicate time to taking a break? And this is not a trick question, but you are a social worker, and what's in your code of ethics. So I'm very interested in this. What is your self-care?
My self-care is bourbon, but I know how to control it. So
That's real.
Bourbon drinkers, yes.
I love I've probably within the last year I've gotten into bourbon, and I think it's learning about bourbon and the history and different things. I also like a good scotch or a good rum or those kind of things. But I've kind of now that I travel, I go to different places and look for different types of bourbon and that kind of stuff. In my role as a resilience trainer, we focus a lot on gratitude. My self-care routine is about gratitude.
Yeah.
Knowing that I do have difficult conversations about suicide or mental health or sexual assault or those kind of things, I have to literally, we call the skill hunt the good stuff, right?
Yeah.
Or counting your blessings. So whether that's going out and having a meal and just sitting at a table and enjoying the food that I have, because I know that there's places and people and kids that don't have that. It's all about gratitude and finding that gratitude to grow and to not let some of these things ruminate, because we let negative events and situations ruminate, and that's all we think about, and that affects our relationships and how we connect with people. But also, as a social worker, I want people to know that I'm approachable. If they see me as being angry or pissed off or sad, or they're not going to approach me. So I want to make sure that I have a good self-care routine, so I can cry when I need to cry, or cry with somebody if I need to cry with somebody. And it's really important to me. And I think my girlfriend works in child protective services, and she's done it for 20 years. And
What?
she tells, yeah, she's done it for 20
Less.
years.
That's got to be a record. That's got to
Hey,
be a record.
Less.
Give
Yeah,
that woman a medal. Like
Yeah,
God.
she needs to have one of those like coins that they give at like Alcohol Anonymous, like 5
there you
years,
go.
10
Good
years.
Lord.
Right.
Ooh.
So she has her bachelor's degree, and then ended up getting an internship in the community that she lives, and she just has stayed there. But she's a supervisor now, and she supervises like 8 other social workers. But to listen to some of the things that she tells me about abuse or neglect or drugs or alcohol, or just some of the stories, helping her find gratitude or taking a break or self-care, is important to me as well. So, it's
Kind
and
of
I
like
see,
accountability.
yeah, accountability. I see so many other social workers in different Facebook groups. I'm so burnt out. I'm so tired. I'm so okay. But how many times have you told somebody else to practice self-care, but you haven't done it yourself, right? So I can't. I don't want to be that person to not practice what I preach.
Yeah.
You know what, Mike? Now I need you to apply for both because they got a couples thing. Take that woman with you. You understand?
Yes.
Nice.
Respond for real.
Yes.
Oh my God.
She deserves to be, because
Woo.
I can't, like, listen, CPS is one of those things. And so when we were going through when I was going through my master's program, and it was like, we had one girl who was a CPS worker, and I'm not kidding you, when she had to do her presentation, you know who Ben Stein is. I think everyone on here knows who Ben Stein is. When I tell you, Ben Stein is the guy that does the eye drops. He talks in a very monotone voice. She literally called herself the female version of Ben Stein. She said, I've been working at CPS so long, I am dead inside. And proceeded to tell us about her case. And I have never in my life felt so much pity for one person from one semester. She lives rent-free in my head by telling everyone that she is dead inside from working at CPS. And I think at the time she had been working there for 10 years.
Did you hear what happened in Texas? A CPS worker showed up on an unannounced visit and ended up finding that the mom killed 2 of her kids and 3 of her kids and stabbed 2 others.
Just recently.
Yeah, just recently, like the last couple of weeks. So
Yeah, and it's like people find that shocking, and it's like it's not shocking. And then CPS workers have to see that's the front lines, and they have to see that, but they're still using their own cars to transport children. Like there's a whole thing we could get on CPS, but it's like that's where my mind starts to go, is like, again, the policies and programs. Like we have to make change, because on a clinical level, like the stuff that's happening is not okay.
When I think of CPS workers, Ayana, I honestly think about you and your caseload, because most CPS workers have 20 plus. And after that, I don't know if you guys remember that Netflix special about a young man that got killed in California.
The trials of Gabriel Fernandez.
And for the very first time, social workers were sued and were brought up on charges. It was like something very rare. And from my understanding, they wind up dropping the charges anyway, but it was like an unprecedented case. But I remember that watching that Netflix special and then hearing how many cases that social workers have, and I'm in no way, shape, or form making an excuse for someone ignoring clear neglect and abuse, but the caseload.
And not only that, but a few of them weren't actually even social workers. And so then social workers also get that, I would say, bad rap, but then it's like people who are social workers there's not enough of us. We don't get paid enough and, whatever to fill these roles, and they don't offer enough positions to fill these roles. But when they do, sometimes they fill the roles with people who probably aren't, like, I don't say qualified, but necessary, don't have the ethics and victim care, trauma-informed care training that we have, or counselors, I guess, or social workers have. So it's frustrating because social workers, if it has to do anything with helping people, it's always like, we'll blame the social worker, but yeah.
Yeah. And tying that back into thinking about the military, how many military members have had to interact with CPS because of mental health, because of sexual assault, because of military members who assault their own kids, their own families. That happens. But we don't see that data. We don't talk about that. That's where this whole violence prevention thing is kind of coming in. A part of violence prevention is addressing some of this stuff.
They hide that under what, FAP now? They hide those numbers underneath of the family advocacy program.
Yeah, and I think that data would be interesting to look at because you don't have, as a social worker, you don't get training in military culture. You don't know how that works, right? So depending on the state that you're in, or depending if it's National Guard or reserves or active duty, those policies don't line up very well.
Military social work is usually a class.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like open class, insert fire hose information. So all the training.
There is, I think University, I want to say Texas, Austin, because when social worker is trying to get me to switch over to social work, she put me onto that. So they have a whole course now for military, for social workers.
Yeah, I've seen some of those courses and they're okay. I know Austin, University of Texas, Austin, and I think there's another program down there.
University of Southern California, when my master's program, we had like a military social work track. It was like military, I should know, I did it, but military policies and programs, which is great. But it was like 3 or 4 classes, but it was also, I still feel like there's so much conversation we need to have about the military culture,
Yeah. And then you have programs like University of Kentucky that does the Army social work program for officers and stuff. So that's a good program. So, but I think going back to the self-care question, whether I need to take a nap or have a drink of bourbon or go for a walk, or I will just take that time because I know that's what I need. So it's okay to do those things, and reinforcing that if I do it and I can help or show somebody else, then they'll do that too. So
awesome. We talked about it before. It's like we're coming up on our hour. It's been an hour. It's crazy. Kim, you can go ahead and ask the last one since you were on my honor. I will try. The Girl Scout.
Oh my goodness. Are you a Girl Scout cookie fan? And be very cautious how you also answer this question. But what is your favorite Girl Scout cookie?
I'm an uncle and I have 2 nieces who sell Girl Scout cookies. I will take the lemonades all day long.
Oh,
so
no. I was a troop leader, and I was a troop leader when that cookie came out, and we have to pick how many boxes we order. And I was like, we'll get 1 case, which is like 12 boxes. I said, we'll get 1. And then all these people wanted them. And I was like, what is wrong with you? What happened to the peanut butter patties is where it's at. But no, so many people wanted them. And oh gosh, I'm just like, no, not me.
I don't mind a good peanut butter. I don't know if I'll try the new, was it raspberry one, but a good lemonade.
The s'mores? Have you had the s'mores?
No,
I probably
you've got to try the ones that taste like Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
Oh, okay.
They have a new one called Toasties, and it literally tastes like Cinnamon Toast Crunch cookie.
I might go with that
all day long. I'm like, what? This is the new Girl Scout cookie. Oh, I love this.
I feel like it's a staple to be in the military, because if you've ever deployed or really been to any base like outside of the CONUS up for the continental US, usually you get some sort of box of Girl Scout cookies mailed to you. It's kind of like a rite of passage, I guess.
My husband was like, please, I will never, he cannot stand Girl Scout cookies because of how much Girl Scout cookies they sent them. He's like, I don't want none of them. He don't care what it, Thin Mints. You can put it in ice cream. He's like, no, I never want to look at another Girl Scout cookie a day in my life. He was tired of Girl Scout cookies. So can't get that man to eat any. Mike, I enjoyed this. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. You're
welcome.
As we say in the military, any last alibis? Anybody?
No.
I hate it when the officers did that. Somebody always had something else to say. Like, yes, I got one more thing.
I'm
But
trying
it
not
was
to. I'm trying not to. 'Cause I messed up and said Austin when it's Arlington that has the certification, the graduate certificate for military social work. So
University of Texas, Arlington,
UTA.
my alma mater.
There you go.
There it is. I know a lot of programs are coming out with DSWs and focusing on military social work, but it's coming. Slow progress. But again, Mike, thank you. I tell everyone at the end of my podcast, time is a finite resource. So anytime you spend it with me, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, Mike, where can they find you? How can we support you? What do you have going on? Hi, child.
Facebook, you can just look me up, Mike Crum. I'm pretty easy to find. Instagram, as well. So, I'm old and I like Facebook. I look at TikTok and I look at those things. I'm like, yeah, I could probably do that. I'm like, no, that takes too much time. And creating content, I'd rather look at content than create it. But Facebook is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me or reach out. So
awesome. Well, thank you. We'll make sure we drop all the resources in the video when we drop our chat. Thank you, everyone, and do good, be good.